are we not only are we combining JAS with, but we are three lots of meetings across the world. The one is from South Africa, from the United States in Seattle, our Seattle Consciousness Education and Research Society. The second is your Jain scholar group. And the third is other experts around the country and around the world. So this is very, very nice. And I don't know whether or not I should proceed or if there's anything that Dr. Pakana wants to say.
Yeah, I will introduce you, Professor Vernon. This is our formal procedure. So I will introduce you. It is 7:34. We generally wait for 5 minutes and start at 7:35, so that those who who are slightly late in joining, they may also join. So that is actually, it is a very happy occasion, very, very happy occasion, and I am very excited about this. That this is the day we were waiting for from last several months actually. So many people were interested in this TDVP model actually. So that is the whole thing. And there are some people here who are already familiar with TDVP model. Dr. Manorlal Kalra, he has read it, and Dr. Narayan Lal Kachara, he has actually read it. Dr. Narendra Bhandari, he also has read it. So some experts are there, and Dr. Shishir Roy from National Institute of Advanced Studies is also here, and he has also read that thing, and he has also read our paper on that on the work of the Annie Besant and the parapsychological studies. So I think now with this informal comments, I would start with your introduction. So, ladies and gents, I am very happy to introduce Professor Vernon Neppe to this audience. I know him from last 5-6 years actually, and we were just interacting informally through emails, and we were exchanging ideas about this TDVP model. So Professor Vernon Neppe, he is MD and PhD and Fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa, a distinguished Fellow with APE, American the Physics Association, and some other agencies. He is basically, a psychologist, and he is a neurologist also, and he is working in so many branches related with these areas. And right now he's Director Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute, Seattle, in the USA. And he is Executive Director and Distinguished Creative Polymathic Professor, the Exceptional Creative Achievement Organization. Then he is Dimensional Biopsychophysicist and Consciousness Research expert. Then he is actually having several other affiliations. Uh, he is Director Human Performance Enhancement Division of the World Institute of Scientific Exploration. Then he has won Whiting Memorial Prize recipient. Then America's top doctors listing under behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry, psychopharmacology, psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, neuropsychiatry, and he has actually several peer-reviewed papers. He is editor of Dynamic International Journal of Exceptional Creative Achievement also, and he was formerly director of the first division of neuropsychiatry in Department of Psychiatry in the USA, this Washington, the University of Washington, and is adjunct full professor, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience, previously Department of Neurology and Psychiatry, St. Louis University School of Medicine, this St. Louis. Then he is a leading psychopharmacologist of the 20th century autobiography in book by this Collegium Internationale a Neuropharmacology come 2004 and leader first US and international delegation in neuropsychiatry and psychopharmacology in 2006, ambassador P2P, a program, Immortality Science Award he got from Romania in March 2020 for his work. And so on, there are many such honors are there. Albert Nelson Marquis Lifetime Achievement Award is there. Then this Gabino, this Barreda Recognition Award and Medal from Mexico, so on and so forth. I would like to just introduce about this TDVP model. Uh, we talk of a unified field theory where we combine four different type of forces, that is electric force, then the nuclear force, weak interaction and gravitation. But there talk about, or I mean, their work which talks of theory of this everything, it goes far, far beyond than this. And they talk of actually really developing a fundamental theory which involves not only these four interactions, but I mean, disciplines like, say, science, spirituality, parapsychology, social sciences, religion, and so on and so forth. Their idea of a distinction which they have defined, it is remarkable, I mean, absolutely remarkable. And I was very impressed by that. And in my opinion, this is a very fundamental work, very different from the modern science. It is an extension of the modern science, this is what I would say. And in our discussion and after reading this work of them, I came to know that it has remarkable parallelism with concepts of the ideas of universe in Jainism. At least 15 parameters I have identified which are there in their TDVP model as well as in Jainism. And that is the reason we have invited Professor Neppe to put forward his ideas here so that we can interact in a more comprehensive way and in a more critical way. So I welcome Professor Neppe to start his presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parkana. It's a pleasure having the opportunity to talk to you all across continents. There are several who have indicated to me they will listen to the recording later. And the major aspect of the title today is on Gimmel, which you will discover is an astonishing component of TDVP, or triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm. In fact, there are some who would regard this as a revolutionary discovery. So please don't be shocked. The first principle is our world is not what it appears. There is much, much more. And that world that appears is what we experience, but it may be for our protection as simple living human beings. There are some revolutionary moments of discovery. And the first revolutionary moment of the 20th century was in 1908 at the Cologne Public Lecture, the 80th Assembly of German Natural Scientists and Physicians, the 21st of September, 1908. It was then that Hermann Minkowski spoke about space-time, the unification of time and space. And he said, the views of space and time, which I wish to lay before you, have sprung from the soil of experimental physics. And therein lies their strength. They are radical. Henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows. And only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent identity. So this was how space-time was born. Initially, even Einstein was uncertain of this, and then he agreed. So no longer did we speak of a separate space and a separate time anymore. There was a necessary union of the two. We jump to 2000, the 21st century. And here there is an addition to this. Not only is space-time in union, but it's in union with consciousness. So space and time are insufficient. We need space-time consciousness. And this was the unification of time, space, and consciousness in 2011. And adapting Minkowski, the views of space, time, and a broad consciousness, a universality applicable to the sciences, to mathematics, and to philosophical ideation. This reflected a paradigm shift and only a kind of tethered union of the three from the very beginning will preserve an independent identity. And this is, so to say, the axiom of origin of Vernon Neppe, myself, and Edward Close, my great collaborator. So we have 1908 Hermann Minkowski, time and space being unified, and the concept of space-time, but that was incomplete. There was more than that. There was not only the union of the two, there was the union of the three, and that third is consciousness. We now know that consciousness is likely what we call Gimmel, and this is one major focus of this lecture. So this consciousness, we think, is Gimmel. Gimmel is the third Hebrew letter in the alphabet. And the discovery of Gimmel, for some, for several of my colleagues, could be the most revolutionary moment of the 20th century. What is Gimmel? Gimmel is that third component, that third substance. It's massless, it's energyless. So it's not only linked up with mass and energy indirectly, it's the third component. We know that Gimmel is consciousness, or it might reflect the vehicle of consciousness, or it might reflect the interaction of everything that is going on in relation to consciousness, but with mass and energy. Gimmel is the symbol of unity. Without Gimmel, nothing in the universe can be stable. So Gimmel extends from the simplest fundamental particle, quantal particle, all the way through to our whole cosmological world. You can call it the third process or the third substance, and it's therefore massless and energyless. And yet we think that the mass and energy work only through Gimmel. You might recognize this. You might recognize things like the Higgs boson, for example, that some are hypothesizing. But that is an ephemeral aspect. It's ephemeral. It lasts for an absolute fraction of a second. Gimmel is universal. Gimmel is ephemeral. Gimmel always is there, and it was there from the beginning. Gimmel allows the existence of all stable particles, and without Gimmel, there is no stability. Why? Because mathematically, everything has to be integral, has to be in ones, in units. And you cannot have that unless there is some component that is balancing. And the amazing thing is Gimmel is linked up quantally. It is linked up cosmologically, and it is linked up to our macro reality, to our physical world. And it might be that therefore, if we have equations like E equals mc squared, that this is insufficient, because where is the consciousness? The consciousness has to be in the Gimmel, and we have to incorporate the extent of consciousness, which is the dimensional component, with the content of consciousness, which is linked up with the solid, or with the mass energy component. And the whole question is this additive or multiplicative? We don't know yet. We don't know how to add the Gimmel or the consciousness into the E equals mc squared, but it has to be on both sides of the equation mathematically. So we have these substrates that are tethered together. They are put together with Gimmel. There are the three substrates: space, time, and consciousness. They're fundamentally related, and indeed they are tethered. And this is fundamental to our model of TDVP, triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm. They cannot be separated because they fundamentally tethered in some way. You cannot have space and time without some kind of consciousness. And that third component is more than consciousness. It reflects Gimmel. And the fact that it's more than consciousness is that Gimmel actually links up with the mass energy and with the space-time. Imagine an elephant, and here is the elephant with its trunk. The elephant perceives this strange object. It's always with him. It seems separate, yet the trunk is part of him. It cannot be separated from him. This is the key to the idea of a tethering or a union. It is always there. This involves maybe some kind of knowledge, awareness of this elephant, knowing that there's something different. And we in dimensional biopsychophysics realize that this is a different dimensional level. Now, could Gimmel not be there? If Gimmel was not there, even the most fundamental particles, the electrons and the quarks, for example, and the atoms cannot be stable. Everything is integral. Everything is in full units. We cannot have half an atom or a quarter of a quark. So when we looked at Gimmel and we made these initial discoveries, we is myself and my great colleague, Dr. Edward Close, and this is even before we began, we realized individually, separately, that Gimmel had to exist, this third component. Gimmel was the missing link to explain much of reality. And that is why this might be the most fundamental finding of the 21st century. Gimmel goes back well beyond the origin event, maybe the Big Bang. It's before this, it's primordial. So it's a simple concept, and we demonstrated this. We're not just speculating. So we got beyond this speculation of the initial discovery of Gimmel, And we showed that it existed mathematically. For example, in the life elements, it existed in cosmological terms, linked up, correlating very profoundly with dark matter and dark energy. And the most marked finding is the correlation of Gimmel with the fundamental components of reality, with the protons, the neutrons, and normalizing electrons to a score of 1. Right there, it is linked up with the Large Hadron Collider. So they've spent billions of dollars on the Large Hadron Collider, and the results you will see are the same in terms of scores once one's normalized scores. Now, one of the questions that has fundamentally been asked was that of the great Leibniz. And this is something that Dr. Close, my colleague, an excellent creative mathematician, maybe one of the most creative mathematicians living in the world today, he was intrigued. And he was intrigued because we always hypothesized that nothing then brought something. Leibniz asked, why is there something rather than nothing? There is always something. And you will start realizing that that always something means that there is an infinite reality. Mathematically, the atom has to exist. And we cannot have atoms without Gimmel, because we've got to have a multiple integral of atoms. We cannot have a half atom, a quarter atom. We've got to be able to mathematically fit these in. And these come in a series of equations that are always 3 Diophantine equations that make something always. And this began with the finite beginning. It even went beyond the finite beginning. It was before that. That something is Gimmel. It is the primordial component of reality. Stability is the key, and it really fits the idea of rotations and movements. And that's one of the reasons why our model is called the triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm, because the rotations are through, we've discovered 9 dimensions, 9 finite quantized dimensions. And those are linked up, not only linked up, the infinite pervades those 9 quantized dimensions. So Gimmel is that third form of reality. The context, which is extremely important, is what Dr. Close, particularly, and I worked with what we call true units, triadic rotational units of equivalence. We made everything equivalent so that from an integral point of view, from a mathematical point of view, the atom has to be stable. It cannot be stable without Gimmel. You will not get an integer. It'll be a fraction. There needs to be a third aspect. You might say, well, let's try again. It cannot just be 2. This is Fermat's last theorem. Pierre de Fermat, the great mathematician who was an attorney of the 17th century. So there is proof that Gimmel exists, and we've mentioned the vortices, and everything, therefore, if they're rotating, have to be symmetrical and stable. And this is because that third form of reality, and the context is true units, triadic rotational units of equivalent. Mathematically, the atom has to be stable to exist. It cannot be so without Gimmel. So this is why all these subatomic particles that are in this particle soup, it's wonderful, but they're ephemeral. We have to have them fitting in well. So does this lead to the hunt that has happened for 100 years, the unification of reality? Is this the hunt for the unified theory? We think so, because if you start looking at a unified theory, you have to say, well, it has to work quantally. It has to work in our macro world of our physical existence, and it has to work cosmologically in terms of dark matter and dark energy. They have to all be unified. And this began our hunt for a unified theory. And of course, leaning on all the wonderful physicist theories that were around beforehand. We know, and here's just the short part about it, that based on the empirical data, the collider data and the Large Hadron Collider, if you normalize those and score the electron as 1, you will notice the proton is 1836 calculated out, and then neutron is 1838. Those are exactly the same figures as we find when dealing with these two units, triadic rotational units of equivalence. Moreover, mathematically, when you start looking at all the periodic table of the elements, you discover that the life elements and a couple of others, for example, elements such as helium and neon, they have more Gimmel than any other elements. And they all are fundamentally the same in terms of being a multiple of 108 cubed. So within our physical reality, there is a difference between the different elements that are linked up, that are relating to life and everything else. There is more Gimmel in the life elements. And then we started looking at cosmological data. And I remember a dramatic phone call I made to Dr. Edward Close. We looked at cosmological data, and I said to him, they correlate absolutely phenomenally. And this is the amazing thing, because dark matter and dark energy, it's varied in terms of trying to even find the exact quantity of dark matter and dark energy. And the correlations here with Gimmel and the components of the atom linked up with protons and neutrons and electrons and the subcomponents in terms of protons and neutrons, for example, up quarks, down quarks. And if we correlate this with hydrogen, which is the major element in the universe, and we throw in a little bit of helium, and we throw in all the cosmological data in terms of these components, we find they strongly correlate. So this is what I mean by a unified reality and this hunt for a unified theory. Empirically, it works with collider data correlating. It works in terms of our own regular reality, physical reality, and taking into account life elements, having more Gimmel, and the same multiples of Gimmel, 108 cubed in terms of the score, than anything else. and cosmologically. This implies a unification of reality. Now, this is not quite, because we have theories, we have models, and these are little components, but we haven't based our work on electromagnetism or gravitation models or the strong and the weak forces. These are all no doubt part of this, but part of it we think only in conjunction with that third component, Gimmel, which allows us to have space-time consciousness and allows us to have energy, mass, which are fundamentally the same, linked up with Gimmel. So you can do calculations, you can look at the different elementary particles, and when you have an electron, the amount of Gimmel in an electron is enormous, even though we're using these figures where the electron is unified to one or normalized. So you can see there are 106 true units in the electron, but 105 of those are Gimmel. And yet these figures with protons and neutrons are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And initially we thought it must be 6, but it turns out to be 8. And we know that these subatomic particles, these protons, are not just one single lot of protons. They are linked up with 3 quarks, 2 up quarks and 1 down quark. The neutron is also 3 quarks, but different, 2 down quarks and 1 up quark. And this produces different kinds of figures. It's amazing when you start looking at this. You might say, well, the neutron figures are different because the proton is the single most stable little particle in our universe. The electron, the neutron is unstable, has a short half-life, 10, 15 minutes, unless it is linked up with the proton. Now, when you do these kinds of calculations, you discover that the Large Hadron Collider scores, this is after recalculation. It's a rather complex one, but this is the end point of it all. The electron we define is normalized to 1. The proton is 1836 and the neutron is 1839. This is astonishing because when we did this quite separately, absolutely separately, and you look at the figures pertaining to true units, triadic rotational units of equivalence, which we call in Gimmel true units, scores are the same, 1, 1836, 1839. So fundamentally, we have demonstrated that the Large Hadron Collider scores billions of dollars spent in terms of mass energy equivalence of electrons, protons, neutrons are exactly the same as the mass energy equivalence of true units, which includes Gimmel. You can see that Gimmel's figures vary with each electron and quark component. So there are 3 quarks. They're always fundamentally 3 quarks. Why not 2? Because Fermat's last theorem would not allow it. Only by Fermat's last theorem can we get these unitary components in terms of the atom. Now, this just illustrates the macro world we're talking about. I mentioned that all these stable life elements are multiples of 108 cubed, cubic multiples. So hydrogen is the most fundamental. And if you go down the line, you have different isotopes of hydrogen. You have helium as I said, one of the noble elements. We have carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and there's the second noble element, which is neon. Fascinating is if you start looking at these proportions, you divide Gimmel with 2 units. What chemical, of all the chemicals in the whole world, other than hydrogen, has the highest proportion of Gimmel? Water. And this is why water is so fundamental. When you start looking at it, you say, well, obviously phosphorus ought to be a life element. It's not actually. It is, if you want, an activating element, and you can see it's not as stable in terms of these rotations. The score is not as high. The element that has the most Gimmel is probably iron. And again, this is not one that is truly symmetrical and stable. So this just helps in terms of reflecting our macro world. Now here is dark matter and dark energy. I call that dark Gimmel. And these are miracle proportions, because you all know that based on the Planck probe, dark matter is probably, when you start working out at it in terms of to the power 3 exponentially, you are sitting on certain figures. And dark matter is 26.8%. Dark energy works out to 68.3%. Together, the whole dot of dark matter is 95.1. But this is the linear calculation. We've got to do volumetric calculations because everything is volumetric. Our model, triadic dimensional distinction, vortical paradigm, is not linear. Everything is 3-dimensional, is volumetric. Suddenly we get 86.01% in terms of total dark matter to the universe. Amazing. The true unit score we suddenly discover is roundabout the same, is 86.1%. The correlations are just about amazing, even though we've been persuaded, we've had difficulty understanding dark matter. And if you compare it with a universal standard, which in this instance is almost predominantly hydrogen with a couple of other elements thrown in like helium, we have the same thing. So we have fundamentally Gimmel being that necessary third substance linked up with our model of TDVP. Gimmel is massless and energyless in content because it's that third substance, but we think that third substance plays a major role in terms of allowing for that mass and energy to occur. And Gimmel is not just any amount, it is a specific amount. So Gimmel, we thought, what is it? And by exclusion, it had to be some kind of consciousness or part of consciousness. What else could it be? And Gimmel, we realize, exists with everything, in every single component. We're not only dealing subatomically, we're dealing, as we said, moving through our macro world to the cosmological world. And quarks and electrons are fundamental, but so are photons. And these photons, we think, are linked up with the infinite continuity. Now, remember that it's not just mass, energy, and here's this third component. Everything is always in union, in macro reality, in dark matter, in dark energy, and quantity. Very important. Gimmel pervades every bit of our existence. Without Gimmel, we cannot exist. And this is why Gimmel has to be the primordial substance. The tiniest quantum involves Gimmel to the greatest cosmological star, to everything physical, non-physical. So Gimmel is always a consciousness, but it's more than that, because as I said, just when you start looking at ideas pertaining to Higgs boson or something which is ephemeral and has to continue existing and is a theoretical phenomenon. This is not a theoretical phenomenon. It exists and has always existed, even prior to the Big Bang, prior to primordial time. And it exists in conjunction with space-time and mass energy. So here's the one law of nature. Here is the Minkowski statement from the 21st century. There is one law of nature. We don't need to have different laws. Same scores for the Large Hadron Collider and 2 units. The quantum component, that's astonishing. Same scores for dark matter and dark energy in terms of Gimmel equivalence. These are correlations, cosmological, amazing. And the same 2 unit scores, multiples of 108 cubed worth all the elements of life. I call that the macro world. And astonishingly, water being the major compound that has more Gimmel than any of the others, other than, of course, hydrogen. Now, you might say this is a little complicated, and it is. If you go on my website, which is pni.org, Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute.org, and you go to the subgroup groundbreaking, you will see articles on Gimmel. And we separated out that article because it was part of a broader article on the nature of reality. But we separated it out because it was so important that we wanted people to be able to read this on ubiquitous Gimmel. So it's critically important, separate it out. But for those of you who are just thinking about this data but haven't had this kind of background yet, there are several articles there relating to 4 dimensions compared to 9 dimensions, pertaining to different kinds of sciences. They might serve as an introduction, because this article on the nature of reality on ubiquitous Gimmel is very, very complex. And it extends, the whole article extends well into over 100 pages. So please, this is the fundamental data, but it's not easy to read. So could that third substance be a consciousness? And is that consciousness something else, something separate? Is it something spiritual? So we have spiritual ideas where we can link up Jain ideas, Kabbalistic ideas, or whatever. Is this third component spiritual? Now, it's just interesting that the name Gimmel, GM, is the same as the God matrix. And of course, you remember you spoke about the God particle. Well, the God particle, there is somebody speaking or somebody making a noise, please mute. The God particle is something that is very, very famous. That's where I think the Higgs boson got the whole name. I think Gimmel is nearer to the God matrix. If you start looking at this spiritually, depends how you define God. I'm not defining God there. I'm just saying that this fundamentally plays a role because we've seen all these rules. Now, remember, there is this concept of embedded, and space is embedded in time. Time is embedded in space. So fundamentally, we have components pertaining to consciousness, being more than consciousness, beyond consciousness. And this is where Gimmel fits in. Ultimately, they're all in union together, but hierarchically, there's space, then time, then consciousness. Now, this is very, very strange. And some will get most upset because you're not allowed to quote from the Bible or quote from anything. But it's all there. In Genesis 1, verses 1, and particularly verses 2, you have a famous statement that nobody's been able to translate. It's called tohu vohu. And they talk about, oh, this must have been the nothingness and the void. It's not nothingness and void. These are the only two places in which these Hebrew terms are used. Tohu vavohu. Tohu is our primordial energy mass, which ultimately, after the Big Bang, or the origin event equivalent, became mass and energy. It existed. Vohu, we think, is Gimmel. This is where the origin of existence is. We've written an article on this as well. It's speculation, but it's fascinating because nowhere else is this kind of thing mentioned. You remember we spoke about something, not nothing. The something is the Gimmel and the primordial mass. And it implies something infinite. Though our world could not exist without being stable. And in fact, when you start going into it, you can actually do calculations based on atomic materialism and say, materialism, that's all you need, your four-dimensional universe. And it's refuted with Gimmel. There are three levels of proof there: the atomic number, mass, energy, and Gimmel. Very interesting, because we cannot get stability unless we have Gimmel as part of the whole atom. So you might say, but wait a minute, we have our paradigm, our standard reductionistic materialist paradigm. Our world is stable. It works in 99.99% of cases. Yes, but not always. There are some complex contradictions in quantum mechanics, in relativity. It doesn't explain so-called psi phenomena. Very, very important. And Dr. Kalkana spoke about our work with the Annie Besant data. Very interesting. And it certainly doesn't explain survival after bodily death. And I've just written a book, and you will find this also on that pni.org, the definitive proof of survival after bodily death. It's coming out shortly, but at the moment, it's available for free. So there are unexplained aspects too of evolution. There are origins, there's conceptual jumps, there's statistical complexities, but everything is based on mathematical logic. Dr. Close and I are amongst those who argue that mathematics is not just for calculation. Mathematics are fundamental. And mathematics can be applied in terms of looking at multiple dimensions. It's not just the standard materialist paradigm that you will see is just a four-dimensional model. Materialism has failed. And how do we know it's failed? Because you will remember that when you do your calculations, the atom is unstable until you add in something else. That something else is Gimmel. So here is our iceberg, but this is just above the surface. well below the surface is a great deal. That well above the surface is what we call 3S1T, 3 dimensions of space, in a moment, a quantum of time. Is this all? We know it's incomplete because it doesn't fully work. It works 99.99% of the time, but not based on the contradictions that we know. For example, in quantum models, we know there are 50 contradictions or incompletenesses. And so we talk about, well, you know, this is just quantal weirdness. You will remember Feynman with this idea. And yet, it's because it's incomplete, because it's not all of it. We can solve all the by 9 dimensions, and we published on these. We're not just speculating. This is conceptual fact. It is based on empiricism and mathematics. So Dr. Polkana liked to call this term 4D, our reality that we have, the restriction of 3 dimensions of space, 1 moment in time, 1 quantum in reality. That's a restriction in R because things like X-rays we can't pick up. But this is only part of our 9-dimensional, quantized, finite, vortical, volumetric reality. Remember that. This is what TDVP is all about. In the finite 9 dimensions that are quantized, that are vortical in terms of rotations across those 9 dimensions, that are volumetric. Everything is 3-dimensional, not linear. And that's not sufficient. It's embedded in an infinite continuity, completely different component. The finite and the infinite are together. So we have our restricted sentient reality, and we have this 4-dimensional component, but it's part of the 9-dimensional finite vortical volumetric model embedded in the infinite continuity. And suddenly we're no longer at 3 dimensions of space and 1 moment in time. That's just what we're experiencing. What exists is, we think, 3 dimensions of space, but those dimensions of space extend far, far beyond the physical reality. What exists is, we think, and this is where the difficulties come in. We cannot absolutely explain it, but it works mathematically. 3 dimensions of time and 3 dimensions of consciousness. That's where the 9-dimensional model comes in. And so there's very little in terms of consciousness in our physical reality. It's a higher reality. And this developed gradually, and this is Dr. Edward Close and Dr. Vernon Neppe with the Gabino Barreda Award from Mexico in 2013. And this is our book that you might be familiar with, Reality Begins with Consciousness. It's available on brainvoyage.com. Reality begins with consciousness, a paradigm shift that works. And this truly is the paradigm shift that works. But you'll notice that this was 2014. It's gone far, far beyond this now. So TDVP, the Neppe Close TDVP paradigm, triadic. We can see it's triadic. Everything is in 3s, dimensional. We're dealing with dimensions which are measurable far, far beyond just the 3 dimensions of space and 1 moment in time in our physical reality. We make distinctions, and everything is made up of vortices. It's a comprehensive paradigm shift that works. It provides a framework for all science. It is involves the physical, the biological, and the spiritual. So we talk about dimensional biopsychophysics. It's not just physics. There's biological components. We've seen that, for example, with the life elements, and spiritual components. And we've spoken about Tohu Uvohu. It extends this model from the least quantum, the lowest level, to the entire universe. When we originally wrote Reality Begins with Consciousness, it had been reviewed by 200 scientists in 23 countries. That's far, far more than that. And yet, most physicists will say, this is nonsense. It doesn't fit our model, and our model is that four-dimensional model. Yet all aspects of human experience must be integrated in the search for truth. And with respect, TDVP does that and provides a logical, mathematical, and scientific framework for all religious, philosophical, and scientific endeavors. So we have our paradigm there. We have the ideas of TDVP. If I had to find a mnemonic, I'm going to give you two mnemonics. The one is inducts with a couple more D's and U's. That gives you the component of the awareness that we've got to be aware of the infinite continuity embedding the discrete finite. Now, the infinite is not discrete. It's a continuity, that there are natural laws for all of reality, that we're dealing with dimensions which are measurable, interfacing, and also distinctions. We make distinctions between different components. So here is the idea of unifying the finite and the infinite. I spoke about philosophically, and our philosophical model, this is the only philosophical model that exists. And although we've published on this, people just haven't picked up on this. They like all sorts of fascinating models. The only model that works based on dimensional biopsychophysics, based on a scientific model, is unified monism. So it's a monistic model, a single model, but everything is unified together. There is consciousness, the broader consciousness, in the inducts, and you know that consciousness is Gimmel. There's tethering of space, time, and consciousness. And you can look at everything from an objective point of view and a subjective point of view in terms like relative to, and from the framework of. That's why I don't like this mnemonic particularly, because the end of it all, that S, subjectivity, objectivity, is just an extra. So now we're talking about infinity. Why is it so relevant? Why am I even mentioning it? Why can't we just sit with the finite? It cannot sit with the finite because the infinite is limitless, it's unbounded, it's continuous, as opposed to in discrete, discontinuous components, which is the finite. The finite has the limited extent of space, time, and consciousness. The infinite is not discontinuous. And it interfaces with the finite. It's not separate. It's not dualistic. It's not a component pertaining to Cartesian or any other kind of dualism. This is the whole thing. The infinite is within the finite. The finite is embedded by the infinite. So how it interfaces, we could argue that it is largely unknown. It's all a whole thing. The whole component is, it obeys the laws of nature. And here is the finite, and there might be the infinite, the continuous infinite. We cannot directly involve the continuous infinite. We can only take it into account, little components of it from the continuous infinite. So ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with the TDVP model, a 9-dimensional, finite, quantized, volumetric model that fits into the infinite. And we have the result, the model of laws that are universally applicable to all reality. Suddenly, we don't have rules that are just quantum weirdness. We have laws that fit everything in both the finite and the infinite existence. You might say, well, is this the supernatural or miracles? No, these are all just broader terms that fit. And we can explain meaningful coincidences this way. And TDVP conforms to these ideas. So we could draw a little diagram with consciousness, tiny bit, in space-time, in our real world physical reality. At the highest level, here is almost all of consciousness, which it contains space and time. So bear in mind, this is not just speculation. We're dealing with 9 spinning dimensions. We proposed a 9-dimensional model in 2011. And by some rather complex calculations, we proved it in 2013. It's not speculative. The initial proof related to the Cabebo angle. So our experience is restricted to 3S1T, but we exist in a far broader reality. And the finite aspect of that reality is a 9-dimensional model, not 15 or 26 dimensions or 8 dimensions. Now, this is not speculation, these spinning dimensions, because it's mathematically proven. And initially, the Cabebo angle in 2013. So it's not just, well, it's feasible, it is testable and falsifiable. And yet that falsifiability is not falsified. And it's peer reviewed, changes the whole ball game. And even in astronomy, it changes everything. So this is our little inspiration, ladies and gentlemen, the finite reality fundamentals, great jigsaw puzzle, the great jigsaw puzzle of our physical reality, just one component of that jigsaw, but we always thought this is what it all fitted in. And this is why there are 50 different contradictions or conundrums in terms of our physical reality. We haven't got it all together yet. We haven't got, for example, how electromagnetism and gravitation fit together, but we are far, far deeper in terms of consciousness, space, and time. So I gave you another mnemonic. I sometimes like this one for TDVP, DICTU, dimensions, infinity, consciousness, tethering of time, space, and consciousness, unification of the finite and the infinite, making existence into a philosophical unified monism. So this is our take-home message. The current scientific model, our physical model, has failed. This failure requires developing a new model, and TDVP is a model that works scientifically, applying available empirical data across the border sciences. And TDVP, like any multidimensional or cosmological model, requires an extension of scientific analyses. This requires the development of trying to understand that there is feasibility. And so we had to develop a model which went beyond Popperian falsifiability and realizing that we had to look at what was feasible. TDVP can be applied across any science. It's not just physics. It's not just that tiny 4-dimensional physics. And it's further validated through mathematics. Remember, mathematics is not just for calculation. Mathematics is fundamental to our world. And once we have that, we have the philosophical model of unified monism, a necessary consequence of TDVP. TDVP is a meta paradigm that works because the others have not, proven mathematically and empirically, and involves these different extensions of scientific analyses. Remember the volumetric component, which was the last aspect of our TDVP model, that we realized that we were always dealing with three-dimensional phenomena. It's just we are experiencing life linearly in terms of time and even in terms of volume. And we don't have some aspects of those volumes. We just have one linear direction. So we have then TDVP. So there's the whole thing, everything's squared away, but actually it's triadic and it's to the power 9. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and we can understand our dimensions and reality using the new science of dimensional biopsychophysics. The most appropriate component of this is TDVP. And I want to just finish by recognizing that this is a combined work with Vernon, Neppe, and Edward Close. It's been an all-embracing multidimensional model, which is different from any previous scientific and mathematical models. And we introduced this 9-dimensional quantized volumetric discrete reality. There's also transfinite, you can always go higher, but there's this infinite continuity. How do we know it has to be there? Because when we start looking at Gödel's incompleteness theorems, nothing is ever finished unless one moves to the infinite. I want to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Edward Close, internationally recognized scientist, mathematician par excellence, physicist, environmental engineer, and of course, dimensional biopsychophysics, award-winning author and international speaker and consciousness researcher. And our website is pni.org for Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute. And he is one of the few people in the world, like myself, who's part of the Exceptional Creative Achievement Organization. Author, developed the calculus of distinctions and dimensional extrapolation, and was able to find, incidentally, a solution to Fermat's last theorem long before, in 1969. It was published in a little book called The Book of Atma, which you will recognize has some very important Eastern implications in terms of Atma and the soul, able to develop triadic rotational units of equivalence in the 9-dimensional model. So I'm now going to ask, so to say, Dr. Close to come onto the stage, except this is a virtual stage. And I've asked Dr. Close to take most of the questions because he's not been speaking. So thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. And I hit the 1 hour that I was given. Any questions?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Vernon Neppe. Extremely good, very, very brilliant presentation in a very short time, which require actually otherwise many hours. So I am really very thankful to you. And most important point is that Professor B.D. Josephson, who is Nobel laureate in physics, he was part of this webinar. I think right now he is not there. Probably he has left. But we are very, very thankful and grateful to him that Professor Josephson was here, and he was very active. He has given, I think, 3 or 4 times he has written in the chat box. So really, it is a great moment for Jain Academy of Scholars to have this guest today in the form of Professor Josephson. We are really very excited. I am particularly more excited because I have sent him some papers in past, and he has actually replied those letters, and I can show you those letters to you. that they were written by Professor V.D. Josephson. This is one letter and this is another letter. So these are something I just was lost in the past. Okay, so now it is open for a question. So anybody who wants to ask a question is welcome now. Then I will go to the chat box. Yeah, Dr. Kachara, Dr. Narayan Laji Kachara, please ask your question. Yeah, please unmute yourself. Dr. Kachara, please unmute yourself.
Okay.